Western Poland, April 1241. Two forces are about to clash in what will become one of history's most devastating encounters. On one side stands the pride of European warfare, armored knights, battle-hardened warriors, the finest military tradition Christendom could muster. On the other, the descendants of Genghis Khan's empire, a war machine so efficient, so ruthless, that it had carved through continents like a blade through silk. What unfolds in the next 72 hours won't just be a battle. It will be an execution, a masterclass in military dominance. A moment that will haunt European memory for generations and expose a terrifying truth. Everything they believed about warfare was dangerously wrong. The Mongol storm had arrived at Europe's doorstep, and nothing would ever be the same. Let's destroy a myth right now. These weren't wild savages charging blindly into combat. That's what terrified European monks would write later, trying to make sense of the nightmare they'd witnessed. The reality, the Mongols were the most sophisticated military force the planet had ever produced. They were the inheritors of a tactical revolution started by Genghis Khan, a system so advanced it had toppled empires from the Pacific coastline all the way to Europe's borders in barely 2 generations. Picture this: every Mongol soldier learned to ride before taking his first steps. He could fire arrows with lethal precision while his horse galloped at full speed. He could survive for weeks on nothing but fermented mare's milk and preserved meat, covering distances that made European commanders shake their heads in disbelief. By 1241, their empire stretched impossibly far. Central Asia's legendary cities reduced to rubble, the Islamic world's mightiest kingdoms shattered like pottery, China's supposedly impenetrable Great Wall, it had failed spectacularly. Now under Badu Khan, direct grandson of Genghis himself, 30,000 elite warriors had already ripped through Kiev, the crown jewel of the Russian lands, and torn across Hungary like a wildfire consuming dry grass. This wasn't random destruction. This was calculated conquest, executed with surgical precision. Badu Khan had split his armies with brilliant strategic thinking. One force devastated Hungary. Another swept through Poland, systematically eliminating any threat that could strike at Mongol flanks. They'd already turned Lublin into ash, destroyed Sandomierz, and left Krakow as a smoking graveyard. Their next target, Silesia, one of Poland's wealthiest regions. Duke Henry II of Silesia, known as Henry the Pious for his religious devotion, watched the horizon with growing dread. He wasn't naive. Desperate reports had been flooding in from the east, each more nightmarish than the last. Entire cities erased in hours, populations butchered down to infants, armies that had defended kingdoms for centuries obliterated before sunset. The messages described something beyond comprehension. Horsemen who fought with inhuman coordination materialized from empty air and vanished like phantoms. But Henry refused to run. He was a seasoned military leader who'd commanded in multiple campaigns. More critically, he understood a brutal truth. If the Mongols weren't stopped here, the road to Western Europe lay wide open. He sent emergency appeals across Poland, Moravia, and the German territories. The response exceeded his hopes. The Knights Templar, legendary warriors who'd battled in the Holy Land, answered immediately. The Teutonic Knights, fresh from Baltic campaigns, marched southward with their devastating heavy cavalry. Polish nobles from across the fractured kingdom temporarily abandoned their rivalries and mobilized their forces. Duke Mieszko of Opel committed his entire military strength. Moravian foot soldiers marched north. Even gold miners from Silesia's rich deposits, men who'd never wielded weapons, volunteered to defend their world. Terrified chroniclers later claimed 100,000 warriors assembled to face the Mongol threat. That number was almost certainly panic-driven exaggeration. Modern historical analysis, examining logistics and population data, suggests somewhere between 25 and 40,000 fighters. Even that smaller estimate represented one of medieval Europe's largest military gatherings. For context, William the Conqueror had conquered England with roughly 10,000 soldiers. The Third Crusade's largest armies barely reached 30,000 men. Against them stood approximately 20,000 Mongols, 2 Tumans commanded by Baydar and Khadan. The Europeans possessed numerical advantage. They wore heavier armor forged with the world's finest metallurgy. They carried the Pope's blessing. They believed divine providence fought alongside them. They would discover none of it mattered. Baydar and Khadan weren't the primitive barbarians European imagination conjured. They were military prodigies trained in warfare from childhood. Baydar carried the bloodline of Genghis Khan, raised within the conqueror's revolutionary tradition. Khadan was son to Urgide Khan, the great Khan himself. These weren't raiders seeking plunder, they were strategic masterminds who'd spent years studying European warfare through an extensive intelligence network. Yes, the Mongols operated spy networks throughout Europe, agents often disguised as traveling merchants. They understood exactly how European armies functioned. The mounted knight represented medieval warfare's ultimate weapon. Hundreds of pounds of armored man and warhorse concentrated into a devastating charge that could shatter any infantry formation. But the Mongols also understood the vulnerabilities. Knights moved slowly. Their horses exhausted quickly under immense weight. They fought seeking personal glory, frequently abandoning formation for individual duels. Most crucially, European doctrine relied on close-quarters combat, while Mongol philosophy emphasized destroying enemies before they could reach striking distance. The European army advanced from Legnica in traditional formation, a spectacle that would have stirred any medieval heart to thunder. At the center rode heavy cavalry, knights encased in chainmail and early plate armor, helmets gleaming like mirrors, lances raised toward heaven. Each knight's armor alone cost what a village might produce in an entire year. Their war horses, massive destriers bred for raw strength over speed, snorted and stamped, eager for violence. Infantry marched on the flanks, Polish spearmen, Moravian crossbowmen, Silesian miners clutching improvised weapons. They sang hymns as they moved, voices carrying across the plains. Priests weaved through the ranks, blessing weapons and offering final absolution. Banners rippled in the wind, the black cross of the Teutonic Order, the red cross of the Templars, Poland's white eagle. It was magnificent, the concentrated military might of Eastern European Christendom marching to war. Then on the horizon, dust. Not the dust of a marching army, something different, lighter, faster, something that felt wrong. The first Mongol riders materialized like apparitions, light cavalry on compact horses that looked almost comical compared to European war horses. The knights actually laughed. These were the terrifying Mongols everyone feared, these undersized men on undersized mounts. They looked like they could be trampled in a single charge. The Mongol riders approached within arrow range, but not European arrow range. Mongol composite bows, crafted from horn, sinew, and wood, could accurately strike targets at 350 meters, far exceeding European crossbow capabilities. The riders fired arrows arcing high into the sky, then wheeled their horses and retreated. Cowards, Polish knights roared, they flee like rabbits, like frightened women. But fleeing was precisely the tactic. This wasn't cowardice, it was calculated military doctrine. For hours, endless waves of horse archers harassed the European formation. They'd ride close, release volleys, and retreat before heavy cavalry could respond. Each Mongol warrior carried 60 arrows. Supply horses carried hundreds more. 20,000 men multiplied by 60 arrows equals 1.2 million projectiles. The mathematics of systematic destruction. The Europeans raised shields and endured, but the psychological toll was catastrophic. Knights trained for glorious charges, for steel clashing against steel, for honorable single combat. Instead, they stood like target practice while enemies they couldn't engage slowly bled them. Horses screamed as arrows found gaps in armor. Men cursed as shafts penetrated mail at vulnerable joints. The infantry, wearing lighter protection, suffered even worse. Duke Henry ordered crossbowmen to return fire. Futile. By the time they cranked their crossbows for a shot, the Mongols had vanished beyond range. The Templars requested permission to charge. Henry refused. He understood what the Mongols wanted, to draw his forces out piecemeal and annihilate them. But maintaining formation, while being systematically shot apart, destroyed morale. As sunset approached on that first day, the true nature of Mongol warfare crystallized. This wouldn't be a glorious battle. This would be a grinding slaughter. By nightfall, hundreds of Europeans lay dead or wounded. Men with arrows embedded in shoulders, legs, faces. Horses had to be mercy-killed. The wounded screams filled the camp. The Mongols had lost perhaps a dozen fighters, mostly from lucky crossbow hits. They established camp just beyond sight, their signal fires twinkling like fallen stars. Throughout the night, Mongol war drums pounded relentlessly, keeping Europeans awake, shredding their nerves. Dawn broke blood-red, an omen even priests struggled to interpret favorably. The European army, exhausted from sleepless night, formed ranks again. Many wounded had died during darkness. Morale was fracturing. Arguments erupted between Polish nobles and Templar commanders over tactics. The Teutonic Knights demanded immediate charge. Duke Mieszko of Opel threatened withdrawal if they continued standing like cattle waiting for slaughter. Henry knew action was necessary. When Mongol riders appeared at dawn employing identical harassment tactics, he made a fateful decision. He ordered Duke Mieszko to lead a partial cavalry charge, not the entire force, but sufficient to drive off the horse archers and perhaps capture prisoners for interrogation. 2,000 of Poland's finest knights thundered forward. The ground trembled under their charge's weight. Lances lowered, shields raised. They were an avalanche of steel and flesh. The Mongol light cavalry, apparently panicked by this overwhelming force, turned and fled. The Europeans pursued, blood singing, hungry for vengeance after yesterday's humiliation. "We have them," Mieszko shouted. "Press forward, glory to Christ, kill them all." The pursuit stretched for miles. European horses carrying armored men began exhausting. But the Mongols remained tantalizingly close, occasionally turning to fire arrows, spurring knights to greater effort. Some Polish nobles sensed a trap, but Mieszko, consumed by battle fury, drove onward. It was exactly what the Mongols had orchestrated. The feigned retreat, the Mongols' signature tactic, perfected across decades of warfare. As Polish cavalry became strung across miles of pursuit, formation completely shattered. The trap snapped shut with terrifying precision. Mongol heavy cavalry. Yes, the Mongols possessed heavy cavalry too, something Europeans hadn't anticipated, emerged from concealed positions in the rolling terrain. Light cavalry units that had circled unseen now closed from all directions. Duke Misko realized his catastrophic error, too late. His force was surrounded, severed from the main army, isolated on open steppe where European knights held no advantage. What followed wasn't battle, it was systematic execution. The Mongols didn't engage in heroic close combat. They circled the trapped Europeans like wolves surrounding sheep, pouring endless arrows into the mass of men and horses. When knights attempted breakouts, coordinated charges drove them back. When they stood still, they were shot to pieces. Mongol heavy cavalry charged only when enemies were already weakened and disorganized. Duke Misko himself fought bravely. Accounts say he personally killed a dozen Mongols before 5 arrows brought him down. His bodyguards made a final stand around his body singing death songs. They were overwhelmed. Of 2,000 knights who charged that morning, fewer than 200 returned to Henry's camp. The survivors were traumatized, some driven mad by what they'd witnessed. They spoke of demons fighting with supernatural coordination, communicating wordlessly, killing without mercy or honor. One knight, his armor pierced by 7 arrows, died repeating, "They are not men, they are not men." That night the Mongols sent Henry a message. Duke Misko's head preserved in salt with a simple note in broken Latin. "Tomorrow you." Henry's war council that morning bordered on chaos. He'd lost nearly a quarter of his army. Moravian infantry teetered on desertion. Several Polish nobles had already fled under cover of darkness with their retinues. But Henry understood retreat was impossible. The Mongols would hunt them down on open plains. The only option was standing and fighting one final desperate battle. Henry selected his ground carefully. A field near Legnica village, Legnica Pole, the field of Legnica. It offered a slight rise giving his archers advantage and a stream on one flank preventing complete encirclement. He arranged forces defensively. Templars and Teutonic knights formed the center. These religious warriors wouldn't flee. Polish knights took the right wing. Remaining infantry held the left. Henry commanded the reserve personally. As morning mist cleared, the Mongols appeared. But something was different. They weren't moving in their usual fluid formations. Instead, they seemed deploying strange devices, large pots or cauldrons mounted on wheels. Europeans watched, puzzled. Were these cooking vessels some pagan ritual? Then battle commenced, and the true horror of Mongol innovation was unveiled. The devices were Chinese gunpowder weapons, not cannons, those were still decades away, but smoke generators. The Mongols had acquired this technology, conquering the Jin dynasty in northern China. As the European army advanced, Mongols ignited these devices, creating massive clouds of thick, suffocating smoke rolling across the battlefield. Within minutes, the carefully organized European formation began dissolving. Men couldn't see beyond a few feet. Commands couldn't be heard through coughing and confusion. Units lost contact. Banners, the medieval command and control system, disappeared in smoke. Knights stumbled into their own infantry. Horses, panicked by smoke, became uncontrollable. Then came the psychological masterstroke. Days earlier, Mongols had captured Polish prisoners and forced them to learn one phrase in Polish. Uciekajcie, straceni jestesmi, run, all is lost. Now in the smoke and confusion, Mongol warriors who'd memorized these words shouted them across the battlefield. Polish soldiers, unable to see through smoke, hearing what sounded like Polish voices, believed their own commanders were ordering retreat. Panic spread like plague. Men began fleeing, colliding with others trying to hold formation. The infantry on the left wing broke first, streaming away from battle. This exposed the center where Templars and Teutonic knights stood firm, but they were now isolated islands in a chaos sea. The Mongols attacked with perfect coordination. How they maintained unit cohesion in smoke remains mysterious, perhaps drums or horns at frequencies cutting through chaos. Perhaps they'd simply practiced this tactic so extensively each unit knew its role by heart. Light cavalry struck from flanks, pouring arrows into the confused mass. Heavy cavalry smashed into broken units, shattering them completely. The Knights Templar fought with courage of men believing they were earning martyrdom. Surrounded, outnumbered, unable to see enemies until nearly upon them, they stood in a circle and fought to the last man. Their Grand Master, Popo von Osterna, was found after battle with 23 arrows in his body, sword broken, surrounded by Mongol dead. The Teutonic Knights attempted cutting their way out, forming a wedge and charging blindly through smoke. They actually broke through Mongol lines, only to find themselves in open country with Mongol cavalry in pursuit. They were hunted down one by one, their heavy armor becoming a death trap as exhausted horses collapsed. Duke Henry, watching his army disintegrate, made the fatal decision to rally his forces. He rode forward with his personal banner, attempting to create a rallying point. For a moment it worked. Polish knights began converging on his position. Then a Mongol arrow fired by an unknown archer struck him in the armpit where armor plates joined. He swayed in his saddle but stayed mounted, trying to continue fighting. His bodyguards closed around him, attempting to extract him from battle. But the Mongols had identified him as the commander. They concentrated their entire force on this small group. Henry's guards died one by one. Finally, Henry himself, weakened by blood loss, fell from his horse. Seeing their duke fall, the last organized resistance collapsed. It became a rout, then a massacre. Mongols pursued fleeing Europeans for miles, cutting them down as they ran. Armored knights threw away armor to run faster. Proud nobles begged for mercy in languages Mongols didn't understand or chose not to understand. Duke Henry, still alive but mortally wounded, was captured. The Mongol commanders, following their tradition of honoring brave enemies, offered him a quick death. He refused, saying he would die as he had lived, as a Christian knight. The Mongols obliged. His head was severed and placed on a spear, later paraded around Legnica as proof of victory. His mother, searching the battlefield days later, could only identify his body by his polydactyly. He'd been born with 6 toes on his left foot. By noon on April 9th, it was over. The scale of catastrophe was almost incomprehensible. The Mongols, following their custom, cut off the right ear of each slain enemy to count casualties. They filled 9 large leather sacks. Contemporary accounts claim between 10,000 and 25,000 European dead. Virtually, the entire Silesian nobility had been eliminated. The Templars and Teutonic Knights lost so many brothers it would take a generation to rebuild their numbers. Entire family lines that had ruled for centuries were extinguished in a single morning. Mongol casualties. Modern historians estimate fewer than 700 men, many from heavy cavalry used in final charges. The battlefield itself was hell made visible. Bodies lay so thick in places you could walk hundreds of yards without touching ground. Carrion birds circled in clouds so dense they blocked the sun. The stench carried for miles. Local peasants would find bones in their fields for decades. In 72 hours, a smaller Mongol force had completely annihilated one of Europe's largest assembled armies. But Legnica was more than military defeat. It was a psychological catastrophe that shattered European confidence and altered history's trajectory. News spread across Europe like wildfire. In Paris, King Louis IX immediately began strengthening city walls and training his army in new tactics. In Rome, Pope Gregory IX called for a new crusade, not to the Holy Land but to defend Europe itself from these devil horsemen. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, locked in conflict with the Pope, suddenly found both sides willing to discuss peace facing this external threat. Letters from this period reveal the depth of European terror. One German chronicler wrote, "The Mongols are God's punishment for our sins. They fight not as men fight with honor and courage, but as demons fight with cunning and cruelty. Our knights, the finest warriors in Christendom, were as children before them." The psychological impact transcended military concerns. The Mongols had demonstrated that the entire foundation of European feudal military power, the mounted knight, was obsolete against a disciplined, tactically superior force. The elaborate codes of chivalry, individual heroism, honor-based combat that defined European warfare meant nothing against an enemy who fought to win by any means necessary. Fortunately for Europe, salvation arrived from an unexpected source. December 1241, 8 months after Legnica, the great Khan Urgidei died in Mongolia. He'd been drinking heavily. Some sources suggest poison. He died suddenly during a hunting trip. By Mongol law, all royal family members had to return to Mongolia to elect a new great Khan. Badu Khan, frustrated but obedient to tradition, withdrew his armies from Europe. The Mongols would never penetrate this far into Europe again. Political struggles in Mongolia, vast distances, and eventual Mongol empire fragmentation meant the threat gradually receded. But the lesson had been burned into European consciousness with fire and blood. The Battle of Legnica forced a revolution in European military thinking. Within a generation, European armies began adopting combined arms tactics, improving archery, and developing early gunpowder weapons. The age of the mounted knight's absolute battlefield supremacy began its long, slow decline. Professional armies gradually replaced feudal levies. Tactics and discipline became more important than individual valor. Some historians argue Legnica saved Europe by teaching harsh lessons just in time. When the Ottoman Turks, inheritors of many Mongol military traditions, threatened Europe 2 centuries later, European armies were ready with combined arms, gunpowder weapons, and professional discipline. The Europe facing the Ottomans was not the Europe that faced the Mongols. The Mongols had taught Europe a lesson written in blood: adapt or die, evolution through catastrophe. And they'd taught it in just 3 days. Today, the Battle of Legnica is remembered differently by different nations. In Poland, it's a national tragedy, but also a source of pride. Their ancestors stood against impossible odds to defend Europe. In Mongolia, it's celebrated as one of history's greatest tactical victories. In military academies worldwide, it's studied as the perfect example of how superior tactics and discipline can overcome numerical superiority and technological advantages. The battlefield itself is now peaceful farmland. A small monument stands where Duke Henry is believed to have fallen. Every year on April 9th, historical reenactors gather to commemorate the battle. They wear accurate armor, carry replica weapons, and attempt recreating the tactics of both sides. But no reenactment can capture the terror of that smoke-filled morning, when the medieval world order died on the plains of Silesia. The echo of those Mongol horses' hoofbeats still resonates through history. They remind us that no empire, no matter how powerful, no system, no matter how entrenched, is immune to sudden catastrophic change. The Mongols didn't just defeat an army at Legnica, they shattered a worldview, ended an era, forced an entire civilization to evolve or perish. All in just 3 days. 3 days that changed the world forever.